folks. My name is John. This is Rob.
I'm Rob.
This is Totally Tanked, the podcast about tanks, the tankiest podcast in tankdom.
That's the one.
Yep.
It is the 3rd of December,
Yes.
2022, and today this is episode 40 of Totally Tanked. And today we are talking about which tank, John?
The Pershing.
The M26 or the T26, various numbers or whatever you want to call it.
So, we are festively adorned. It's the festive season, so
Yes.
we have Santa hats and tank goggles, which I can't actually see out of. So having done our intro, I think now might be the time for me to put my glasses on.
He's abandoning his costume already. Anyway, well, we're talking about the Pershing. We'd just like to give a quick shout out to all our wonderful patrons, so our supporters.
Oh yeah, hang on, we need to put them on the screen. There we go.
Yes, thank you very much for your support and continued support and to us, and I'd like to thank you. John's also brought out a number of new designs for the t-shirt shop.
Very sexy t-shirts. So patreon.com, search for Totally Tanked, it'll come up. If you want to give us a couple of bucks a month, which really helps and pays for beer and hosting and all those things. And then on redbubble.com, if you search for Totally Tanked, one word, you will find our t-shirt designs, some of which look really, really nifty. We're wearing some of our older designs now, and I do have a lot of new ones that have the colour green in them, because when you do a tank podcast, the colour green does come up a lot. And that means we can't wear them in the podcast because
Green screen.
It's actually a green screen behind us,
not a blue screen.
Not a picture of a Pershing with a penetration in it. Who would have thought? Yes, so having got that little bit of housekeeping out of the way, Rob, what do you want to start us off with the Pershing?
The Pershing.
Was it a heavy or a medium?
It was both.
It
started out as a medium, but it then became a heavy, and then it went back to being a medium because it didn't know what to self-identify as. But anyway, we'll give you... We'll start off.
Brave.
We'll start off with some stats on the Pershing. So it was designed from 43 and it came into production in 1944. It's a World War II tank, obviously. So again, a very quick turnaround period of time for the tank to be designed and actually get out. Some might say that it wasn't actually finished design when they actually started rolling it out, because they were pushing it out before it had actually been tested and figured out what the best configuration of it was. But
and speaking of that, if you get into the development history, it gets extremely complicated because there is a number of T prototypes.
T standing for testing, or
before you get to the designation M26. So there was a T26, which was largely what became the M26. But it is all a little complicated, and there are elements. And then there's the Super Pershing, which was kind of a T26E4 with extra armour. And the best way to tell a Super Pershing is it's got a flat mantlet because they just bolted more armour onto it instead of a nice curved mantlet.
And if it's one of the originals, Super Pershings, it's got some nice big springs stuck on the outside of it to hold the barrel up. Otherwise, the turret was all unbalanced and it couldn't turn. But we'll get to that. Okay. So anyway, with the Pershing, there were 2,200 built. It was 46 tons, 20 feet long, plus another 7 foot sticking out from the front of it for the barrel. Very, very long barrel.
I mean, a huge barrel in most variants, and then in the Super Pershing, a 73 caliber.
51-inch shells, single piece shells to start off with.
Yeah,
and that's 51 inches. What? About 4 foot, so quite
tall. A usable tripod. So just to clarify, when we talk calibers in cannon, not handguns, a caliber is the bore diameter. The bore diameter is one caliber, and for reasons that make sense to cannon manufacturers, it's very important to measure out the length of the barrel in the bore diameters. So it's a 90mm gun. If it's 73 calibers, it's 73 times 90mm in length.
There you go. Something we all needed to know, and I'm going to forget straight away.
Yeah.
11 feet wide, 9 feet high, so it's shorter than the M4 Sherman, which was coming along to essentially support, not so much replace at this stage of the war, but it was coming along to support it. Crew of 5, so you got the driver, co-driver, loader, gunner, and the commander. Standard configuration for US tanks at that point in time. 70 rounds of the for the main gun held inside the tank. As we were saying before, it was
a literal requirement of the US Army at that time to have 70 rounds. I think Pershing only got up to like 66, but it was near enough.
Some of the prototypes got up to 66, and that's what they were trying to push across.
Yeah.
And whereas the Army had said, no, we want at least 70 rounds in there.
When we talk later about things people are learning in modern war in Ukraine, having more rounds in the turret is now being considered a really bad idea, but at the time that was what they wanted.
They didn't have any external carousels or blowout panels or anything like that to muck around with. They just needed tanks that could put out a lot of shots. 90mm gun. That's probably the big thing. That's the big reason for having this tank, was that they were pushing out the 90mm gun. Because
the transition very quickly from the M3 medium to the M4 Sherman.
Oh, guess what this gun's called, John?
It's the M3, isn't it?
It's an M3 as well. Just in case you're wondering.
Everything in the US Army in the 1940s is called an M3. So they transitioned quite quickly from the M3 medium, which, as we've talked about, was lots of good bits put together very badly, to the Sherman, which was extremely functional, world-beating at the time of its introduction.
In 1942.
Yeah, and they were hoping that maybe it would be good enough to be effective at the end of the war, which in many ways it was, particularly with the 76mm gun. But in the development pipeline, they said, okay, what's the next thing going to be? What's next year's tank?
And there's a lot of talk about saying they hadn't realised that they needed something hadn't realised that the Shermans weren't going to be able to take on the Tigers and the Panthers when they hit D-Day, and suddenly they were faced with a great number of Panthers. No,
they were highly aware of.
That's exactly what my thoughts. But there's a lot of notes written that they weren't aware of, saying they've been facing Tigers since '42. They knew what was out there, and it's not like they weren't facing any Tigers in North Africa or Italy. So they knew these things were there before D-Day. So the fact that they're trying to make up excuses for saying that they didn't know the Shermans weren't going to be able to handle the heavy armour. Yes, that they wouldn't have faced a lot of Panthers, if any, in Italy, I don't think. But they were around. As I said, there's plenty of Tigers.
But the 76mm gun on the Sherman, okay, we talked about this in the Hellcat episode, remained a highly effective and lethal weapon all the way to the end of the war. Yes, there were German tanks that it couldn't penetrate the glasses plate of, but you had a lot of other options for dealing with the very rare occasions you face those big cats. And it sort of otherwise just becomes a willy-waving competition of, we've got to have a bigger one than them.
But as we'll get into the American tank on tank versus tank destroyer strategies and doctrine of saying we're not going to look to have tank on tank battles. We're going to look to have, because there is no point having a tank going up against a bigger tank, whether or not you have a gun that can take it out or not. You're much better off having an anti-tank weapon, whether it's towed, whether it's a mobile on tracks, or however it's deployed, versus a tank, because an anti-tank weapon will always take out a tank, whereas a tank weapon may not take out a tank. And that's what they were looking at. The Shermans were there for infantry support and to basically assist them carrying out their role.
But for everyday use of the American Army in northern France, the not even the 76, the 75, which had a better high explosive shell in the older Shermans, was widely preferred by the crews and the infantry they were supporting. So the need to have bigger, better, and we will get into the costs of having bigger, better in a big way. They literally had units refuse to take the 76mm gun because they didn't want to lose the capabilities of the 75s. And yet at the same time, you've got folks back in the United States, sometimes for their own commercial reasons, but also for entirely genuine reasons of wanting to have the best possible equipment for soldiers in the field, saying, whoa, let's do the next big thing.
And look, the Russians and the English were going through that process themselves at that time, and they were able to, they'd come out with the idea of heavy tanks earlier than than the Americans had, so they just didn't have the numbers coming out. So some further stats. As I said, we had the 90mm gun, the M3, 4 inches of armour on the upper hull and the lower hull and the front of the turret. The turret sides had 3 inches of armour, and then the hull sides had 2 to 3 inches of armour as well. Also had 2 30 cals, so one for the co-driver, so bow gunner, and one in a coax row.
The Americans loved their 30 caliber machine guns in World War II.
So it's a good, decent, useful piece of kit.
It's just interesting how these days it's really fallen out of favour with the 50 cal being the intermediate weapon.
But I guess, if you have the 30 cal in infantry support roles, then you're building lots of them anyway for the infantry, so you may as well just throw them into tanks as well, because the infantry is not going to be carrying around a 50 cal. They are going to carry around a 30 cal, and then therefore you've got all the ammunition that you want for interoperability between your infantry and your tanks.
You definitely do not want a light weapon on a tank that can't share ammunition with the surrounding infantry. Absolutely.
And then you had your 50 cal in a pintle mount on the outside for anti-aircraft role. And
which again is a funny weapon in that role. I mean, it's definitely what it does is deter planes from coming really up close and personal to you. Your chance of actually shooting down an enemy plane with a 50 cal on the ground is grim, but it can force them to fly higher.
Yeah. Or if it's some sort of spotter plane, then you might want to take that out.
He'd have to be coming low enough to read your epaulettes, though.
Okay, Ford engine, 8-cylinder, gasoline, 450 to 500 horsepower.
Can we talk about the engine?
Yes.
So the Ford GAF, which is the engine, was Ford had an idea. We want to make something like the Merlin.
Yes.
And obviously the Sherman is the weird shape it is, and it's way too high because it was originally built for an aircraft radial engine. So that made some sense, and it was quite funny because later Shermans didn't use the radials. They were even diesel Shermans, but they used more compact power plants.
Yeah, and the Radial 9 being air-cooled meant they didn't have any cooling facilities around it, and so that's why it could go that way, whereas the Ford was water-cooled, so they could make it a bit smaller because they didn't need the extra air going around the outside of it.
Yeah, for tanks, water-cooled engines are really the way you want to go if you have a choice. The engine never really delivered on what it was supposed to. Around the same time, maybe a little earlier, the Packard company did try to build Merlin engines in the US, and they actually came across a huge problem that the tolerances of the British Merlin engine were so great, so imprecise, that American engineering, which was building to much tighter tolerances and much greater precision, that the thing seized up, built to American specs. So Ford was trying to build an engine that could be a high-performance aircraft engine or could be a high-performance tank engine, and it was not a wildly successful engine, unfortunately. And we're going to get into a little bit more of that. It's accused of being underpowered. I mean, for me, a 500 horsepower engine in a roughly 50-ton tank.
Yeah, 46 short tons. So it's 10 tons more than the M4s, but with essentially the same power output of the engine. Yeah. So you're going to be moving slower.
Moving slower, but it's still not enormously underpowered. One thing that they did have problems as well, though, and I think this is why it got written up as underpowered, this is all headcanon, I don't have any proof of this, is because if you've got an engine that overheats easily, you have to not run it as hard.
Right.
So you end up with less usable power because you're worried about overheating the thing. And that's partly sticking it in there. But what they did do, and why the Pershing was such a seminal, widely important tank and really underrated, for the first time for the Americans, and one of the first times in the world, they put the whole power pack, transmission, drive sprocket at the back all together.
Yep. So it didn't have anything running through the middle of the tank.
Yep.
There's all in the back there.
Which is how a tank should be. By modern standards, it's the only way to do it, unless you've got your reasons to put the engine at the front, and then you want
survivability. And everything else,
and then you want everything up the front. But what you don't want is to be spreading the whole all that machinery through the body of the tank. So Pershing was a real trendsetter in being really early with that. It also was one of the earliest American tanks to use torsion bars, which is still very much the best way to do tank suspension.
That gave it a much smoother ride for the crew.
More reliable
and they could
ride.
actually, and plenty of accounts of it being able to hit targets on the move. So being able to fire shots accurately on the move is a big benefit for World War II tank, and they were able to achieve that because of the smoother ride.
Yeah. So it was revolutionary, and it was the arrival of a future that we still have today. The arrangement of the engine, the suspension. Now, torsion bars are brilliant. And for those who don't know, it's basically you take two steel bars and you wrap them slightly around each other, and as the weight goes on, they wrap further around each other. And it's a very clever way to do springs, much better than coil springs. The problem with torsion bars that you have to deal with is it occupies a lot of internal volume in the tank. Whereas your Christie or Horseman, which is an evolution of Christie, which the British used until quite recently, all the springs are on the outside of the tank, so they're not taking up space in the...
My personal experience with torsion bars, they're a very useful thing to make people carry around for physical training exercises.
Oh, okay.
Yes, because they're just a big, about a 3-foot length of lump of steel that's just heavy, and you make people carry them and lift them over their heads and all.
And slices of torsion bars make excellent gifts at tank festivals.
There you go. So there you go. Okay, so sorry, I just mentioned there was 46 tons. Yes, we've got. I've done the armour. It's got a range of about 100 miles.
Which is fine for the time.
Exactly, and that would have been one of the points that they said. Yes, it's got to have a fuel tank to such a degree that it can go for 100 miles. On-road speed of 48 k's an hour, but a very slow off-road speed of only 8 k's an hour. So it did not move as well through the bush. Standard gun elevation and depression of plus 20 degrees and minus 10 degrees.
So can we just talk about the depression elevation? Because this comes into, again, the Pershing was 1943, the tank of the future. Basically, if you put it in a lineup with any of the Pattons or the M60, you would be quite hard pressed at first glance to tell which was which.
Yes, the shape of them is...
It is a continuity of design elements all the way through. And part of that is the big boxy turret, which looks a bit silly compared to your sexy Russian frying pan designs, but allows for the gun to point a long way up and a long way down, which lets you put your tank behind a berm and point over the top.
Or and top of a hill.
Or if you're on the top of a hill, or if you're moving into a town, there are numerous cases and enormous number of examples of real-world combat where it is a crucial part of tank design to have good depression and elevation of the barrel.
And speaking of good crucial designs of tanks, it also had a tank phone. There you go, boys and girls. So don't worry about that.
Now, was it the first to have a proper phone?
I did not look that up.
Again, it was an early one.
Yeah.
Matilda had a push button that was like a doorbell. And
that was the Japanese had the doorbell.
Yeah, Matilda had it as well.
There you go.
But with Matilda, they did just replace it with handsets because they realised once we've got a wire that can make a doorbell sound, we can actually...
just hook up a field phone.
Yeah.
There you go. So the cost, as you were saying before, it was about, in dollars at the time, it was around $83,000 versus a Sherman around $50,000. So for the M4, so the Sherman was cheaper, but again, and weight-wise and size-wise and everything else, you could fit a lot more Shermans onto a cargo ship than you could Pershings and all that sort of stuff that went with it.
But the issue was also at roughly 10 tons heavier was the bridging capacity and the capacity of European bridges to carry it, which we're going to have a lot more to say about that.
All right, so we'll quickly go into the stats for the Super Pershing. Only 25 built. They weren't wanted. There was one left at the end of the war. There's one left these days, right? All the other 24 were used as range targets to see what can go through the side of a Pershing tank. It's got, as we said before, it's still got the 90mm gun, but it's got the T-15E1 gun with the 73 caliber.
Which is very, very long, just to belabor this point a little more. A modern Western tank has a 55 caliber gun.
Yeah.
Now, admittedly, that's on a much bigger bore diameter, 120 mils over 90, but it's still proportionally an extremely long gun.
And because there's such a long gun, and they just fitted into the same turret and as the standard Pershing, what that meant is that there was far too heavy for the gun to be able to. So the traverse inside the Pershing is an electric traverse left and right, but the elevation depression is done by is a manual operated. So the gunner has to wind a little wheel to raise and lower the gun, and that was too much for the strain for the gears inside the tank to be able to do. So they do get around that. In the first designs, they put a bunch of two huge springs on the front of the turret to be able to counterbalance the weight of the gun, to be able to allow the gunner to raise and lower the aim of the barrel.
Yeah, not everything was a perfect vision of the future, but it was still, unbelievably futuristic for 1943.
Yep. And they eventually came up with a system that balanced it out inside without having the great big springs on the outside.
Which is also just problematic in that, it's a part of the tank that gets shot at a lot, and one of those springs cops a shell.
And other things is that because it was so long, if they went down any sort of ditch or incline, the barrel would stick into the ground very easily. Even when they had the barrel traverse to the rear, it would still get stuck in the dirt when going down.
Oh, okay, because when you come back up the other side.
Yep.
Yeah, right.
Yep.
This is the problem with a tank with a very long gun, is it starts getting stuck in all sorts of things. I just want to quickly...
You can't go through towns of any sort because you cannot manoeuvre the tank and the barrel around a corner in a narrow street.
Particularly a European town.
Yep.
Particularly the narrow streets that tend to be around the bridges, which is why the town is where it is, because it's got a bridge over the river. Just quickly to acknowledge, so for the podcast listeners, we do this as a YouTube live stream as well. So we're just going to briefly acknowledge our commenters. Tasman is watching from Sydney. He's been admiring our hats and goggles, so there you go. Alan says Merry Christmas. Alan, it's always a delight to hear from you.
Thanks, Alan.
Minty just tuned in to say it's 12:15 in Nova Scotia and they have to go to bed. But they will listen to us on Spotify.
Can I do the rest of the podcast with the goggles on?
Yeah.
No, I probably can. My eyes are good enough.
Yeah.
It's just the visibility downwards. I'm going to miss. You see a lot of the top of my head as I look at the notes, so probably not. Tasman
also does note that the Sherman was the first tank to have a field phone. Sherman was first to have the field phone. Okay. Cool. Awesome.
I'm sure we spoke about that during the Sherman episode.
We might well have. It was a long time ago. Many beers under the bridge. Okay, let's get back to the Pershing.
All right, so we'll probably get more onto the Super Pershing, but I thought I'd just throw in the stats there. Okay, so World War II. I'll give a great shout out to the Chieftain. Has a great video on the complex reasons why of who and who didn't want the Pershing in Europe. But essentially, the army said
Is this the bit where I talk about Leslie McNair?
In a minute, I'll just
because I've got new slides for McNair.
Oh, okay, but in a second. So I'm not going to get into that detail. You can go into that detail. So the army said no to taking test guinea pigs with combat testing. So they said, okay, so you've got this new tank and you've tested it and it's really capable. And the Ordnance Department who were making it said, no, we're going to send it over there so you can test it. And the army said, so you haven't actually had somebody else shooting it? No, we want the Germans to shoot at you as part of the testing.
I have a lot of sympathy for people saying a battlefield is not your proving ground. It's not your place to test things. Get it right. Then send it ready to go with all the other train of stuff you need, with training and manuals and spare parts and training the mechanics. You want to get this stuff right before you start wandering vehicles across the battlefield.
All right, so that's one of the reasons. Introducing a new logistics train to Europe was not wanted. Again, everything else has been pretty much standardised to the M4. To throw into a new logistics train for a new tank would complicate matters. And
just quickly, I want to revisit something we talked about long ago in the Tiger episode, and also in the M4 Sherman episode. We've talked about the lifting capacity of cranes, both in the US and in Europe, because you've got to take it out of the ship. And
at your port and docking facilities.
yeah, and the Sherman was built to be pretty much the maximum weight that any of these things could handle. Which is one of the reasons why no one wanted to take the Pershing, because none of these facilities would be able to handle it. Now, I did have someone at the time say, hang on, how did the Germans get Tigers to North Africa if it was impossible for the Americans to get heavier tanks to Europe? And the answer is the Germans used railroad ferries.
There you go.
Yeah. But the problem with using railroad ferries is railroad ferries are supposed to be carrying trains. And they're very rare and...
not usually going across seas.
Yeah, and valuable beasts.
They go across lakes and rivers type things, not seas.
Well, sometimes straits and things. But if your train ferry is doing that, then your trains aren't getting across the strait, and they're probably meant to be carrying, industrial things and important other things for your society to wage war with. And also they are real magnets for torpedoes and bombs from the other side, because
they're not known for going fast.
Yeah, and they really stand out.
Yeah.
And they're known to be a key weak point.
Because you don't have a lot of those, and you only have the ones you probably built in the civilian infrastructure, rather than it's not huge in your wartime infrastructure build.
Anyway, the US had no plans to use train ferries to cross the Atlantic. So the Pershing, with its 10-ton extra weight, was going to put a real extra load on the logistics capacity in very key areas of other extremely heavy things they might want to ship across the ocean.
All right, so another reason was the Army didn't ask for it. They said, as John was saying before, they were quite happy with their Shermans. So, and yes, they're also too heavy. So, too heavy for the bridges of Europe, too heavy for the port facilities.
And too heavy for the tactical bridging units, who had temporary bridges they could build that were Sherman weight, but they were not Pershing weight.
So the engineers did not like them. So basically there was, and as I said, there were a number of factors. Now, I'll let John go into General McNair.
Leslie McNair, all right.
He was one of the big names in deciding, you know what, we do not need these things in Europe, thank you very much.
Okay, Leslie McNair is a weirdly, largely forgotten figure now, although he does get mentioned a bit. He was, in the 1930s, he became the youngest brigadier general at the time. There was a guy in the Civil War who was a couple of years younger. But he was in his 30s when he made brigadier, which is...
Quite young.
He's a bit of a high achiever, highly motivated person. And as they say, all the corpses on Everest were once highly motivated people. So... McNair, very smart guy, literally an inventor. Like he'd look at a problem in army supply and say, we need a different saddle for those mules, and get that designed. Also, a bit of a raging asshole by most accounts that I've come across. And McNair was initially in World War II running what is it called, Army Ground Forces, which at one point had 2.2 million men in its command, and was essentially responsible for the training and equipping of the armies that were going to be deployed elsewhere. So a very senior but kind of administrative sort of role. Then he was in Europe and extremely influential in saying, no, we do not want a heavier tank. We do not want a tank that the bridging can't use, that no one's trained in, that we don't have a logistics train for. We don't want a whole new engine that we're going to have to train new mechanics for.
The Sherman's doing fine. We've got plenty of those, and we want more of those.
McNair was saying the Sherman is doing fine. Now, meanwhile, the Sherman was increasingly obsolete and outgunned, and one day we will do the Panther episode and talk about that. But when a Panther was not broken down...
The fat cat?
When a Panther was not broken down, or even a Tiger, a Sherman needed a lot of help to deal with it.
Yeah. Some figures people like to throw around is that a Panther's worth 10 Shermans. Unfortunately, they always bring 11. Yeah.
And I think a lot of that is a bit bollocks, and certainly when you also had things like Sherman Firefly, one tank with a heavy gun in the platoon, and the 76mm, the Easy 8 Shermans, all sort of address this, but there was still...
And then lots of artillery and close air support to just drop a 500-pound bomb on them and just make it go away.
But also, the fact that Germany's industrial capacity was being choked and the Air Force was blowing up every fuel tank, within 100 kilometres of the front line, and the special free cranes that were the only things that could lift the turret up, because everything in a Panther or a Tiger had to have the turret lifted out to do any maintenance, and these cranes were much sought after by the close air support. So there's a lot of arguments about what's actually a good way to win a war, but fundamentally, significant parts of the American military were saying, why is our tank second rate to a German tank? Why don't we have a tank as good as a German tank? This stuff feeds into letters home. Admittedly, a lot of that stuff gets censored, but not everything does. Journalists are writing reports saying, the Germans have got better tanks than us. The average American sitting at home reading the papers like, why do the Germans have better tanks than us? And that creates a lot of pressure to do something. And Leslie McNair said no to all of it. What he wanted was more Shermans. And we talked about this with the Hellcat. The argument sort of does become, have we actually got a shortage of Shermans? Because we've got a shortage of Shermans, then sure, more Shermans. But when we've got so many Shermans that we don't know what to do with them, maybe we've got room in our supply lines for something a little more specialised. And anyway, McNair was absolutely against this. It was not going to happen. And then after D-Day, when Patton had been the commander
decoy commander.
Yeah, the 1st United States Army Group. Not to be confused, this gets so complicated. This is why it worked on the Germans. 1st United States Army Group was a joke formation that didn't really exist.
Ruse de guerre.
Yeah, and we kept saying, well, we're going to land at Calais, 1st US Army Group's going to land at Calais.
So lots of signals, information going out from Patton, him calling people out and saying, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that.
But there was a 1st United States Army. That was real. There was a 1st United States Army Corps. That was real. 1st United States Army Group, not real. So it was quite clever that they had these real formations with similar sounding names to a thing that sounded very important. McNair was placed in command of this fake formation as basically the only free general they had who was sufficiently senior to give credibility to it.
After D-Day, you mean?
Yeah, after D-Day, Patton took command of 3rd Army and went, charging around.
Once all the troops were deployed to France, McNair no longer had a role within England, so they said, right, what can we do with you? We're going to give him command of this...
fake formation. That must have been a tough conversation, because,
Well, Patton had to go through it.
Yeah, but Patton had been benched for punching a soldier. And whereas McNair wasn't being punished with the FUSAG posting. But, okay, then you get Operation Cobra, and boy, if Americans love an M3, they also love Cobras. And I suspect it's because it's the most penis-looking snake. But anyway, that's not that important. Operation Cobra, this was American forces breaking out of Normandy, and they had this brilliant idea that worked so badly that they never used it again, of using strategic bombers in a stream to pound a tactical target and reduce it to rubble, and then they could cross over. 1,800 heavy bombers. It would have been quite a sight. It was such a sight. Leslie McNair went down with his binoculars to have a close look. And in this enormous stream, these 1,800 bombers attacking an area a couple of miles wide and a few more long, was working really well, and then they started deviating from the stream because, they got hit by crosswinds or just little navigation errors, and bombs started landing on the American front lines, including landing on Leslie McNair, blew him sky high. His body flew into the air with the horrified armies watching.
Don't worry, he's dead.
He's definitely dead. There's no happy ending here for Leslie McNair. They hide his death. They have a secret funeral that only his aide and 4 other generals attend, including Patton.
I mean, your 4-star generals you don't usually want them getting killed on the front lines type thing.
Yeah, and particularly saying this idea of using strategic bombers turned out to be a bit dangerous. A lot of other soldiers also died. It wasn't just McNair. And the results, worked, like they were able to break through these German strong point.
Cleared a path through the German lines in order to create a breakout for Operation Cobra.
But despite it working, they never did it again. They just said, nope, too dangerous, too many friendly fire casualties, despite it actually being an effective tactic.
Probably too much resources to try and get the Air Force to do it again. Or the Army Air Corps. Or
it was the Mighty Eighth did the bombing. But, anyway, McNair was dead in mid-late 44, and with him gone, the resistance to bringing a new tank into the order of battle ended, and eventually they got some Pershings into Europe, which becomes the next part of our story.
There we go. So, first 20 Pershings were sent over and arrived in January of 1945. They were divided up in different ways. So, 20 went to 1st Armoured, 10 went to 1st Armoured, 10 went to 3rd. And they divided them up again, however they felt like within those army groups. So one had one Pershing with 4 Shermans running around. Another had decided that we'll keep 5 Pershings altogether, and eventually, they'd ordered by this stage, as soon as obviously McNair passed away, they ordered 250 before testing had been finished and established prototype even finished. Eventually 310 made it to Europe. However, that first 20, the only ones that actually saw any combat. So those 20 then went into battle. First contact for them was the 25th of February, where Fireball was the tank named Fireball was snuck up on by a Tiger 1.
I love how this gets described.
Yeah, I'm gonna get into that.
It's because they keep calling it an ambush, and I'm like, if you're in Overwatch and the other tank comes up and blows you up, you haven't been ambushed. You have failed.
You weren't watching. Yeah. All right, so they got snuck up on by a Tiger 1, which is
snuck up on by a Tiger 1.
Within
clank, 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 clank.
Within 100 meters. Right, so they've gotten pretty close. The Tiger 1 has put 3 rounds into the Fireball. From 100 meters away, it went in through the coax gun port, killed the loader and the gunner. Another one went into the barrel and cooked off the round that was in the barrel. The crews, and then a third one's bounced off the hull. The crews bailed out. Sorry. The surviving crew, the Tiger then backed up to, once it was discovered that it was there. Surprise, surprise! 3 rounds going into a tank tells you where there's a tank around somewhere. Got stuck in.
Yeah, the Tiger got stuck.
The Tiger got stuck in some debris, having reversed in the dark. The crews bailed out. However, Fireball was repaired.
Now this is where we get to the toughness of the Pershing. Like it took, yes, a lot of people died inside it. Bad day at the office. But the tank was not destroyed despite being hit by a Tiger 3 times.
Back in action 2 weeks later. So because the Tiger was abandoned, captured, and Fireball was repaired, the US is calling that a win. They won that encounter.
Yeah. I mean, it's often the way. You might, do a lot of things wrong, but you still sort of end up ahead at the end of the day.
They're calling that a win, just like anyway. All right. So soon after, on 25th of Feb, another Pershing took out a Tiger 1 and 2 Panzer IVs. Then the 6th of March, the Cologne Cathedral standoff. So the US Armoured Forces are going into Cologne. There is a Panther parked out the front of the Cologne Cathedral. Proud as you like, seen a couple of Shermans come up, took some shots at those, knocked them out, and said, "I'm a Panther, you guys can't hurt me." But over just down the road was a new Pershing, and it's been called into action. As it's come around the corner, they've seen the Panther. They were told that the Panther wasn't going to be looking at them, but then they've come around the corner. There was the barrel pointing straight at them, so the drivers kept on going rather than stopping and firing, which is quite clever. Inside the Panther, the story goes is that they've seen this tank. They don't know what it is, and so they've paused firing to figure out, that's not a Sherman, what is that? Is that one of ours? And not wanting to shoot one of their own team. And have not fired, and then as the Pershing is driven forward out of the basically away from where the gun is lined up, rather than stopping at the corner where it was going to, the drivers just kept on going, and then they've put 3 rounds into the Panther, set it on fire. 4 of the crew got out, but 4 of the crew, 3 of the crew, I can't remember. But the other amazing thing about all this is that it was all captured on film. There was a camera crew right there at the time capturing it all happening. So that was a pretty amazing battle to be captured on film. The first Pershing in action versus the Panther.
No accident. You know, when you've got your experimental advanced tank, you want to, well, particularly when you've been under so much media pressure about not having good tanks, like, oh, look how great it is, get the cameras up there to record it. The fact that it's almost in insignificant numbers is something the media doesn't need to know about.
No. However, the same day, another Pershing was killed by a rare Nashorn. So this is the 88mm
tank destroyer, basically. Tank
destroyer from just down the road. Later on, 4 Pershings helped capture the bridge at Remagen. So there is a movie about it.
What happened next when they captured the bridge at Remagen, right?
They've moved in 4 Pershings. There was a platoon of 5. One of them was out for servicing that day. They've moved in. They've helped. The Germans hadn't blown the bridge, so the Pershings have moved in. The infantry have gone across. They've taken out a number of machine gun nests with the Pershings and scared all the Germans off and said, "You beauty, we've taken it." And then as the infantry is taking the other side, made sure the Germans can't blow up the bridge. And they said, we're going to send these tanks across to Germany. And they said, hang on a second, you're too heavy. You're too fat to come across this bridge.
Too fat for the bridge.
So the M4's got to go first into Germany, across the bridge at Remagen, and the Pershing's got to come across. Even having actually sorted out the day, they had to wait for the barges to come along a couple of days later to ferry them across.
Yep. So the
bridge was damaged during the fighting. That's why they didn't want them to
The engineers had to build special barges to ferry the Pershings across. And meanwhile, the unit they were with had disappeared off into the distance, leaving them behind. I don't even know how you begin to organise your logistics support to catch up when you've been left behind like that. You know, it's calling someone up saying, oh, we're going to need a fuel truck. Anyway, that would have been difficult. And the point that's really interesting here is that there were 2 different approaches for deploying Pershings into Northern Europe. One was as independent platoons. Well, not independent platoons, but a platoon of Pershings.
Yeah.
The other one was to put the Pershings mixed in with the Shermans.
So, again, a platoon of 5 tanks, one of which was a Pershing, the other 4 were Shermans.
Now, what happened in both cases was when you got to a bridge that the Pershing couldn't cross, which was most of them, the Shermans would go ahead and the Pershing would sit there for days and weeks until someone figured out a way to carry it over the waterway. And this does come back to McNair's point that a lot more needed to be done than just wheeling tanks off the dock and saying, hello, look, we've got a heavy tank here. And some of the things that needed to be done involved rebuilding all the bridges of Europe that you haven't even captured yet. So having a tank that can cross those bridges does seem a lot more important when you think about it. And in both cases, what happens when you have a platoon of Pershings and what happens when the Pershing's in another platoon is the Pershing gets left behind because the Shermans can advance into places that the Pershings can't. And much as I don't think I would have enjoyed Leslie Minet's company enormously, I think he might have been right. Maybe I would have enjoyed his company. Obviously, he had a lot of interesting ideas. I think he would have,
Just would like to hang out with him in the bar, maybe, but not actually have to work for him.
Maybe. I haven't actually seen that many adverse reports of what it was like to work for him, to be honest. He just, annoyed his everyone else because they're like, yeah, we want the new tank, yay. And he was like, whoa, hold up, you haven't thought this through. So maybe he was me. That feels like the role I perform in the workplace.
All right. We're going to do one more thing on the World War II. So they were sent to Okinawa because they was having some issues. The M4s weren't achieving their goals there, and they wanted something a bit bigger. However, by the time they arrived in Okinawa, in the Pacific Theatre, was in beginning of August, and guess what? Some bombs got dropped very shortly afterwards, and they were really needed by the time they were unloaded.
To be fair to the American military-industrial complex, which is not a sentence I'll say every day, very few people knew that nuclear bombs were coming, for obvious reasons of secrecy. You couldn't be telling too many people about that.
I think the military-industrial complex during World War II was very useful and effective. Its role after that is where I'll be saying it's... Hang on a second, you're a bunch of corrupt, money-grubbing, bloody murderous bastards.
Yeah, Murder Incorporated. But the point being that, not knowing that we were going to use secret super weapons that converted matter to energy, you had to be planning for, what was it, no, I can't remember the name of the operation. Right, planning for this enormous invasion of Japan, and you're going to need better tanks than the Sherman for that. Because that was going to be a bloodbath such as the world rarely sees.
All right, one more point about the Pershing before we get into Korea was the name of the Pershing. All right.
Yes, Blackjack Pershing.
So John...
Who is in the slideshow.
John, during World War One, General of the Army is John J. Pershing, also known as Blackjack. So this was one of the first tanks the US decided to name themselves, rather than
the British naming it, and
sending it across to Europe and having the British name it and coming back with, oh yeah, no, that's a Lee, or that's a Sherman, that's a Grant. So they've said, yeah, hang on a second, we're not letting the bloody Poms name another one of our tanks, and they've actually come out and called it a Pershing from the get-go. Well, sorry, I shouldn't say from the get-go. From some stage during the tank's life, the Americans have named it themselves. Now,
John Pershing was also quite the arsehole.
There you go. Tell us more about him, John.
Well, interestingly, General of the Armies doesn't have a current rank that it translates to. But particularly with his, because they tend to do the
American Expeditionary Force.
Yeah, the American Expeditionary Force of World War One, but they do tend to do they give them a rank bump on retirement, which is how 5-star generals exist when they really don't use anything higher than 4 in the table of organisation. But Pershing would have been a 6-star on retirement. And I mean, it was a very big army. He had the American Expeditionary Force. The point that is most worthy of remembering about Pershing was that on November 11th, 1918, he did not let his subordinates know that the armistice had been signed and that the war was ending at the 11th hour. He gave no instructions to cease offensive operations. And 3,500 Americans, I think it's described as casualties, so they weren't all dead, but thousands of Americans died and were seriously injured because Pershing was an arsehole. And I'm all for, when you're negotiating peace on the battlefield, you do need to keep attacking to improve your situation on the ground before the peace deal is signed. But on the last day, when the deal has been signed...
just waiting for the clock to tick over.
Yeah, it is unforgivable to be letting people die. I'm all for saying we want to be attentive and alert and hold our positions and don't let the enemy get away with anything, but to actively let men go to their deaths completely unnecessarily.
We're going to take that hill before 10 o'clock in order to get another 100 metres further forward on the battlefield. No, that's not really needed. So...
Added nothing, did nothing, completely senseless. He was dragged before Congress to explain himself and muttered some things about old General Fox said keep going. Pershing, what an arsehole. Having said that, did have a cool tank named after him. So, swings and roundabouts.
Now, we'll just go into a bit of the legacy of the Pershing tank. So, as I said, came out and developed and came out in 1944. By 1948, they decided they're going to up engine and fix a few of the issues within the tank itself, and it came out as the M26. And what's the M26 called, John?
It's one of many patterns.
It was the first of the Patton tanks. But all it was the M26 Pershing with a new engine and a few other upgrades to it, and yet they've renamed the tank. So Pershing only got 4 years of the tank being named after him. He died in July 48. Patton died in December 45 after a car accident. And by November 48, so 5 months after, or 4 months after Pershing has died.
Oh, they waited till he died.
They've waited till he died.
Oh, right, okay.
So 4 months after Pershing has died, they've taken the tank that essentially is just an engine upgrade to what was named after him and renamed it to the M46 Patton. And the Patton then went on to have a legacy through to the 1990s. In fact, it's still out there today. I should say the entire one's still running around with the M60 patterns.
Well, hang on.
No.
Don't you go calling an M60 a pattern, but many people do.
Yeah.
And also, I would say, I alluded to it earlier, our audience have a lot of very smart people who spend way too much time looking at tanks. So I'm not saying none of you could pick the difference in a lineup between a Pershing and all the rest of the range up to the M60. But if you just had flashcards giving you little flaps, you would struggle because they are very similar looking tanks with very similar designs, which I think comes back to the legacy. That it's actually quite astonishing that this design that they came up with in 43 was viable to some extent even today, although just because they're upgraded M60s, I wouldn't want to go to war on one of those myself. But there'll be the pointy end of the spear if the war kicks off in Taiwan.
Yeah. So as I was saying, old Blackjack Pershing got 4 years of a tank that was named after him, and then suddenly became the Patton, which has a legacy much longer. From 4 months after Pershing died. So, I mean, let's face it, if Abrams' tank is going to go around for a long time, that name is not going to go anywhere. And the number of times that tank has had a different engine put in it, and is still essentially the same tank. And so
it's an interesting thing. I mean, the exterior shape of the Abrams hasn't changed dramatically. The basic design is there.
Oh, yeah.
They did a lot of very clever things with building it to be able to, what they call them, black boxes, just replace modules, which are built to a spec rather than having to redesign the whole tank, which is part of the extreme longevity of the Abrams. And there will come a time when there's a new type of armour that has different physical properties, and then they will need a different type of shaped tank. But that time is not here or now. So
General Abrams' legacy is going to keep on going in that name, whereas Pershing's only lasted 4 years. Yeah. Anyway, we'll move on to the next war that Pershing was involved with, which was Korea.
Yep.
So,
it made a mess of the T-34s.
But before it made a mess of the T-34s. All right. So when North Korea invaded in I think it was June 1950. The US UN forces and South Korean forces had nothing to stop the T-34-85 streaming over the 38th parallel and forcing down to the enclave in Busan. However,
the Busan perimeter.
Yeah,
I did see. Sorry, I don't have it in the slideshow, but I actually saw a picture of a US Army captain just after he'd been informed that his company was not getting resupplied. And would have to hold the Busan perimeter with no ammunition. And that was the look of a man who'd really had enough.
Fixed bayonets, buddies. That's what you got.
I mean, MacArthur quite rightly gets a lot of stick historically because when the great list of American generals who are arseholes comes out, he will be vying for the top spot. But the Incheon landing was an act of significant genius pulled off in a lot of very clever ways, not least pulling Japanese navigators out of retirement who had served in the Imperial Japanese Navy to pilot the landing boats.
The logistical efforts of an amphibious landing is just huge. So. Anyway, so when the invasion first occurred, there were 3 M26s sitting unattended in a Tokyo car park, military car park, and they've been. Nobody had actually been looking after them. They'd just been sitting there. Somebody said, "Oh yeah, no, we've got some tanks around." And guess what? They were very quickly shipped across to South Korea when the war started. And whilst defending Chingu, there were 3 of them there, and they were on 31st of July, which, guess what? Korea actually gets really stinking hot in the middle of the summer. And guess what? This is really stinking hot. This is the middle of summer, and their engines overheated because they hadn't had any sort of the maintenance attended to them. So the tanks overheated. The crews said,
Pershing's always had engine overheating issues.
Yeah, which is fine in Northern Europe.
Yeah,
in Europe, in various places in Europe. But in July, 31st July in Korea, it's really stinking hot, and so it overheated, and the tank and the crew said, "Yep, we can't do anything for this defence." Disabled the vehicles and got the hell out of there.
Now there is in a North Korean museum a Pershing in Pyongyang. I think we've got it in the slideshow. Not entirely sure if I got that in there or not. But so the North Koreans did manage to capture one of them and dragged it back. Which there would have been, you could make a whole movie about the Koreans dragging the captured Pershing back to Pyongyang. But
if they just get it started, if they got one of those 3 started up somehow. Oh no, anyway. Who knows? Anyway, so that was the beginning of the war when the North Koreans were streaming over the border and forcing everybody down south. At the same time, the US is saying, "Oh my god, oh my god, oh my god, oh my god." All we've got is M24 Chaffies over there, and they do nothing against the
no, the Chaffee does not do well
against the T-34-85s that the North Koreans are using having been provided them by the Russians. So the US tank battalions so they've still got a number of tanks over in Europe, obviously, but they've started pulling out, said, "Oh, we need to get all our tanks ready for deployment to South Korea." One tank battalion, the 70th Tank Battalion at Fort Knox, has pulled a World War II memorial M26 off a pedestal and reconditioned it for use. And so, let's get that bad boy up and going again, and try to get everything organised to be able to send tanks back across to South Korea. So again, getting them up and running, because you can't redeploy the ones from Europe and they're a lot further away. So you want to get everything across to the west coast of USA, get them on a ship, and then ship them across from there to somewhere safe probably to Japan first, and then across to Korea. So you have them ready to go. But due to lack of numbers of the M26 in America that were up to speed, most tank battalions went across with M4s. So again, it's going back 10 years it was going back for 8 years from getting the M4s across first.
Because they're lighter and they're easier to get in and out of ships.
And the M4s essentially didn't. I mean, they were okay against the T-34-85s. Big thing was the North Korean tanks is their visibility when they were facing off against the Chaffies and or no tanks. They did very well, which is why they had such a huge advance down to Busan. But once the Pershing started, but they were on par with the M4 Shermans, and so whatever the battles that occurred, even though the Shermans counted for 50% of the North Korean tanks taken out, there was a parity there rather than a dominance from the Shermans, and so there was plenty of them taken out by the T-34-85s.
It does give a really interesting reference point, these Korean tank battles, because the T-34 is still historically very contested. Was it a garbage tank? Was it a great tank?
It was a great tank to have if nobody else had a tank.
Well, also, just the whole, if a T-34 had ever been built to spec, it would have been great, but mostly it was, thrown together and thrown at the front line with no expectation it would last more than a couple of weeks. And you've got to suspect that the post-war tanks were being built to a higher spec than the ones being built whilst the Battle of Stalingrad's raging. So, but the T-34 was certainly competitive, and I would argue North Korean tank crews probably were not as well trained as US tank crews. So
No,
to
all had the maintenance and logistics supply chains.
Yeah, although it's a little easier when you're only driving a couple hundred kilometers south of Pyongyang versus shipping your logistics across the Pacific.
Anyway, so the once the T-26s the M26s got across to Korea, they were found to be far more effective and far more deadly against the T-34-85s, and they were able to their counterattack up the Korean peninsula all the way up to the Chinese border occurred, and at which point basically all the North Korean tanks had been taken out during that advance, and it was only in February I'll just say that, of the 300 M26s deployed to Korea, tank-on-tank battles only really occurred during the first 6 months, after which the North Korean tanks had been destroyed. So that's from Busan up to the Chinese border. When the Chinese volunteers turned up in February of '51, they didn't bring as many. They brought limited tanks with them, and they were dispersed within the infantry. Dispersed within the infantry, so there was very limited tank-on-tank battles after February '51 when the Chinese volunteers came charging over the border.
Yeah, it's also worth noting that Northern Korea, rather than North Korea, is extremely hilly countryside, whereas in the south you get more flatlands, which is why historically the south was more agricultural and the north was more industrial. So the push down to Busan was far better tank country than when they were fighting the push back up to the Yalu River.
Yep. So and what was found is once they got up to the Chinese border, the M26 engine could not handle the hills of Korea, and so was withdrawn from early 1951 and replaced with the up-engine M46.
Which is a really interesting comparison here. We haven't done the Churchill tank yet either, but Churchill's in Korea, less powerful engine, but very heavy tank, but adequate cooling and good low gears, could crawl their way up to very high mountaintops and at least provide a reconnaissance position and a bit of fire support. Whereas the more powerful and lighter Pershings, but that didn't have adequate cooling for the engine, just cooked up.
Yeah, and so the Pershings also had the Torquematic automatic transmission,
which was great in the Hellcat, but wasn't quite up to the.
Yeah, it wasn't good for your hills because you could only do your low gear was 1 to 9 miles an hour or something like that. So it wasn't good for 1 mile an hour or 2 miles an hour. It was such a big range on that low gear that it couldn't deal with the hills.
Yeah. Tasman's pointed out Centurion was also good at climbing hills. Correct. Centurion also had a lot of low gears. We talked about how its top speed wasn't particularly special, but it could really get to 5 kilometers an hour very quickly.
I'll just quickly go over some. A lot of the good points. The Pershing did have a lot of good points, as I was saying before. It was the design. It was basically the precursor to a lot of good design points, which was the.
Well, a lot of designs that were introduced in the Pershing are still in use today by every tank in the world. It actually set a standard for what a modern tank in the 21st century would be in a lot of ways.
And where the M3 Lee Grant and the M4 Sherman were a case of let's get out a bunch of tanks really fast and who cares what they look like, what they do or how they work. With the Pershing they actually took the time and said, okay, what do we want for our tanks to be able to work well and do well? So they had storage bins on the outside rather than just trying to strap everything on the outside. They had ease of access maintenance hatches, so you could maintain the engine much easier. Not as easy as the Hellcat, but it was much easier to get to and maintain it. It had an auxiliary engine, so you didn't have to have the main engine going. Burning up all the fuel if you just wanted to be able to traverse, sit on spot and traverse your turret around with the electric engine. It had smooth ride torsion bar, power traverse, good visibility and good communication. So again, they'd taken a lot of feedback from that they hadn't been able to put into the M3s or M4s and said, okay, we want something that's actually going to be useful, not just functional and get as many out the door as we can in the shortest period of time and get them shipped across there. Saying, well, let's actually make it useful and a bit more sustainable and can carry its own stuff and do everything else itself when it gets across there. So like Cold War times. Because it had such a short lifespan as the M26. There wasn't a huge. They were deployed They were held in Germany, but with the M46 coming out from November of 1948, with the better engine, a lot of the M26s said, right, rather than they reconditioned plenty of them into the M46, M47, and M48. But plenty of the other ones, they said, okay, we're not going to bother reconditioning these, we're just going to build new ones. So Belgium got, in 1952, Belgium got 423.
That's a lot of heavy tanks for Belgium.
It is. But the fun part of this, they didn't last. They didn't hang on to them very long. But the fun part was that they had to name the units in both French and Dutch because they didn't want to go one way or the other. So the unit names of the M26s would be the Regiment de Guides or / Regiment Gidson. So you had to have both names in the unit name, and that would be a real. If you were a lieutenant in that sort of, or a subby in that sort of unit, and you had to say that every time you were announcing the unit name, you're bloody annoyed. They also had units in West Germany. They very quickly got the M47s, and they gave their M26s to the Italians and the French in 1952. The French quickly replaced them with the M47. In Italy, continued to use their M26s through until 1963, and that was pretty much the end of the M26. It was the Italians using those. Anything else we want to go over, John? What about the entrance?
I think that's about all I've got to say on the subject of the Pershing.
Okay, so one last thing I want to come out with again. The legacy of the tank. So it was good enough to kill tigers, king tigers, and panthers, if it ever ran into them. And look, it ran into, of the 20 that actually made it to combat in World War II in Germany, it ran into a few.
They definitely queued them up because it was so rare to beat those. The intelligence must have been saying, we think there's some heavy units here, let's make sure they're in the right place.
There were a few times they said, okay, like with the Super Pershing killing a Tiger II, nobody believes that actually happened. There's a case of, there's lots of accounts of the single Super Pershing that made it across. Oh, we should talk about that. All right. So once the Super Pershing got across to Europe, they said, right, let's make sure this bad boy survives. So they welded another four armor plates onto the front of it. So 2 angles to increase the angle of about 40 mils each, and so we gave it another 80 mils on the hull of boilerplate steel, and then they took the side out of a Panther and they wrapped that around the barrel and throw onto the front of the turret, and there was another 80 mils of armour there. And then because they just added 5 tons of armour to the front of the tank, and it was already front heavy and they had the springs, they had to add another 5 tons of armour, basically 5 tons to the rear of the turret in order to balance it out again. But they said they got it in there and ran it around, and it supposedly took out a Tiger 2 here and a Tiger there and a Panther here and a Panther there.
But let's bear in mind that every Panzer IV in Europe was a Tiger to the people who were fighting it.
So there is lots of accounts of that happening, but everyone says the real historians are basically saying there were no Tiger units anywhere near where it was deployed. Anyway, that was going off a little track of what I was saying. Yeah, so it was, the Pershing was good at taking out Tigers, King Tigers and Panthers, if it ever ran into them. Still not so great that it wouldn't survive them. So it was a case of, and you're not looking at Russian optics and engagements here, you're looking at German optics who can engage a tank at 1,000 metres and damage it. And so the Pershing wasn't the idea, whereas the Tiger was brought in to be a dominant tank that would survive and basically encourage everybody around them, because it was the tank that nobody could hurt and would lead the charge into the fray. The Pershing wasn't that. It was there to take out those tanks, but it would probably survive, but not necessarily. There was more parity rather than dominance of the battlefield.
Yeah, I would say that there's a thing that's often quoted. The historian Honeycutt apparently saying, "Oh, it was better than a Tiger, but not as good as a King Tiger, and on a par with an IS-2." And maybe, but Honeycutt was trying to sell his book about the Pershing at the time, so he did have a bit of skin in the game.
And like the Hellcat, I would say that it would and did, the M26 Pershing would and did do very well against T-34s and probably IS-2s if the war had continued. So if the Russians had decided to continue on with spreading the communist revolution to the rest of Europe, which was always, I mean, having seen what happened in Japan, they might have been rethinking what they were doing, but there was always a chance there that the war was going to kick on.
Well, I can see how Western planners were concerned about the possibility. That was a very real concern, that they had no real insight. With the benefit of what we now know about the state of the Soviet Union in 1945, they didn't have the manpower reserves. They had warned that, 20 million dead. They just didn't have enough young men left to fight. It was getting some peace was something Stalin desperately needed, just simply so that he could get more young men of military age. But Western planners had no way to know just how dire things were in the Soviet Union on the manpower front in 1945.
Yeah. So if the war had continued, the numbers of the Pershings built were still important for what would come next, even before the Iron Curtain fell and Churchill declared the Iron Curtain, and then
What was the Potsdam? No, there was a speech he made in the US.
Yeah. And then you had the Berlin lift and everything else that went happen from there. So anyway, we're going to take a short break here. We'll come back with...
Well, it'll be time for the beer review.
And you'll never guess what sort of beer we got for this one.
You will never guess. Okay, so we're just going to put the break graphic on, and just bear with us, folks, and we'll be back. Hang on. All right, folks, we're back.
And what sort of beer we got today, John? Beer.
It's a big, long purple thing. It should be shaped like a cobra.
I was looking for beers the other day. I was like, I've got to find something American. And you know what? It's been a busy week. The only place I could get to had Coors and Budweiser, and I was saying, you know what, bugger that. But in the international section, right beside it, were these large purple cans that said beer. And you know what? I like the idea. It says beer lager. You can't be confused as to what this is. It is beer and it's a lager. It's actually an American style lager, and it's made by...
Doesn't smell like an American style lager. Woof.
It's made in Portugal at the Font Salin company. There were some words, I looked it up online, there's some words about a dam beer.
There is an Australian brewery called Bolter who do the same thing. We'll just say, we'll just say it's beer. I would say Bolter make pretty good beer, though. I'll give them that.
Anyway, it's an international beer. It's Portuguese. And it says beer. And I said, you know what? It was too hard to find anything else. As I said, it's been a busy week.
Look, Alan, we're sorry. Alan and all the other... the US does make up the bulk of our audience, and we're sorry that an American tank got lumped with this Portuguese...
beer.
Jeez, it doesn't taste good.
Doesn't.
It's not great.
Well, now that we've done it, nobody else has to suffer through this.
Look, the can is attractive. Admittedly, it's a bit, Mace Windu, but... Because, for the audio-only audience, it's nothing but purple with just the words beer lager in moderately small type at the bottom.
4% alcohol, 500 mils, and the where it comes from.
Smallest type you will ever see to
meet requirements, legislative requirements, and I could not see it in the store. I had to look it up. My poor old eyes were not could not focus well enough on it to be able to say what it was and where it came from.
Also interesting, canned by Font Salem, not brewed by. Anyway, imported by Liquorland Australia for the cheapest thing they can slap the words beer on. God knows where it was brewed. And I normally try and say something positive about a beer, but...
Would you rather a Budweiser or a Coors?
Yeah.
Okay.
I really would have preferred a Budweiser or a Coors.
Well, I saw this, I said, you know what, this looks interesting.
I'm going to have to drink this thing, Rob.
This looks interesting, and I thought I'd give it a try. And now we know. And knowing is half the battle.
Now, XA Coupe Guy has just joined the chat. He owns a Stuart Tanks.
How much fun would that be?
So we might be coming to see you sometime soon, mate. It'd be good to have you on board for the stream. Okay. Is there anything else you want to say about this beer? It gets a little better as it sort of numbs your taste buds.
I was about to say, when we get down to about halfway down the pint glass, it'll be fine.
Intriguingly, I mean, I live in a pretty bougie suburb, but at the local shops this morning when I popped by to buy a case of beer, with the cost of living crisis that's going on all around the world, thanks to the Ukraine war, tanks back in, the craft beer is piling up because they haven't yet cut back their orders. No one's buying it. The regular domestic lagers are almost completely gone because people are, switching, downsampling their choices. So I had to buy Great Northern, which is Queensland Bilge, but it's still far superior to this Portuguese stuff, Rob.
Well, what I will say, John, is that I did see in my local store the other day a 6-pack of Fosters. Somebody actually selling Fosters in Australia.
Yeah, that's how desperate times have gotten. But not so desperate that I would buy a case of this stuff.
How Fosters ended up in a store in Australia, I'm not sure, but it's there. It's not even in the imported beer market.
The thing that drives me particularly nuts is that if I ever get 5 hours in my life, which apparently I might never, I can actually make my own beer that is very good, and
it is very good.
And yet I am drinking this. This is what it's come down to.
This is where life is at. Yep. All right, so let's talk about some other things.
Yes, so let's, what do we got? Oh, we've still got Pershings on the screen. Let's fix that, because it's time.
Super Pershing, there it is with the springs and the extra armour and the plates at the front.
Okay, there we go. There's the control map in Ukraine. We'll even get the, hopefully the patrons coming across. There we go. Right. Thank you all, you are amazing. So just a quick shout out for the audio feed. David Mulvaney, Vikram Murthy, Brian Jenkins, Scotch 12, they are apprentice level patrons, and Stamps are artificer level patron. Thank you, folks. Your small monthly financial support is actually enormously helpful for us to keep this all going. So
love you all.
If you want to also get shout outs in the feed and other perks and bonuses and getting involved in decision making, patreon.com, totally tanked. So, Rob.
Yes.
Okay,
Ukraine.
We will put in the links in this video later. Come back 24 hours. The video that Lindy Beige did, who's a very popular YouTuber who does tank stuff reasonably often, and he interviewed a British foreign fighter who's returned from being part of the Ukrainian Legion. And it was a very interesting, it's pretty much the only talk I've seen in English with someone who's actually been fighting on the front lines in Ukraine.
And not a lot of discussion about fighting on the front lines, but a lot of things about what actually happens when a foreign fighter gets over there. And it was very useful to see that. Lindy Beige also had a chat with this fellow in the airport as he was flying across.
I thought he'd get his head blown off. I felt really relieved to discover he'd actually made it back home.
Yeah.
Now, I don't think the guy's a completely reliable narrator because he's got
He's a bit of a yarn teller.
He's a bit of a storyteller, and he's obviously a young dude with a thirst for adventure. Not the worst dude in the world, and I probably would enjoy buying him a beer and asking him some questions.
I'd love to have a sit and chat with him, but we don't know how reliable the situation is to be able to say, taking everything he says is gospel. But
his observations are still interesting.
Oh God, yeah. And the observations of going over there and people who are signing up for it saying, "Yep, I want to fight the Russians," and finding out, oh, okay, we don't have all the logistic support that the US or Australian or English military provides for fighters on the ground.
But things like, oh, we need air support. Well, that's not coming. Oh, we need an artillery support. Well, that might be 5 hours before there's a tube to task this mission. Oh, I need a medevac. Well, you better start walking because the first aid post 10 kilometres that way. And interestingly, his criticism, I don't think was aimed at American people in general as Americans. It was particularly people who were part of the enormous bureaucratic organisation that is the US Army and hadn't had specific fieldcraft training. So he was saying the people who'd been Rangers were just as useful as anyone else, but the general just US Army bureaucrats who had decided they wanted to be involved didn't have a lot of skills.
Yeah, the US Army is renowned for its logistics ability of being able to get stuff to places, and that is a huge ability for a modern force. And the thing is, if you aren't the US Army, you don't have that logistics force behind you providing hot water, showers, food, fuel supplies, everything else that goes with it, medical supplies, anything that goes with that. So it was really useful. And like his comparison of saying, yep, being able to organise a festival and saying there you've got a lot of people going in and out, you've got a lot of things moving around, you've got a lot of people needing to be fed and needing to be able to go to the toilet. It was a really good comparison, I thought, of being able to over there and saying this is an environment that you need to know about, and then talking about the fieldcraft skills that people didn't have. Of okay, normally you'd be able to have boil in a bag and a hot water stove to be able to cook up your MREs, and saying no, having a little ghillie stove, which is basically just a stove, a metal stove that you can throw some twigs into and it'll boil water for you, and then be able to do anything with that was very useful. That was his thing, and because he would do, it was working in that sort of environment, so it was really useful to be able to see what you didn't have and did or didn't have.
Yeah, I mean, by the sound of it, most of his core contribution to his company was simply that he could make boiled water because he'd brought a Dixie stove that he could put little twigs into, and that's actually no small thing for he made some really good points about -20. I don't think I've ever experienced -20. I've experienced -5, and that's given this. We're talking centigrade, which has certainly given me a view of what -20 might be like, and things like having merino long johns and wool hoodies and things like that makes all the difference. And people who haven't experienced that cold really don't even begin to understand what they're about to endure.
And it's not just a case of being the 3 minutes sitting on a chairlift as you go to the top of the ski run in Japan where it's -25.
No, it's sitting in a wet hole for 6 hours. Yeah,
and then heating up your body as you ski down that hill in the dark, and saying this is cool, versus sitting in a hole for the next 12 hours before you're allowed to move around anywhere because you have to stay in the hole while the shelling is happening, and you are freezing your literal bollocks off. There's a big difference. There is a big difference. You can only do so many push-ups to keep yourself warm in that sort of environment.
Well, sometimes you can't. Sometimes you've got to stay in your hole.
Well, no, you do push-ups in the hole. That's why. That's what keeps you warm while you're doing.
Yeah, well, you're burning calories though. But one of the other things he was talking about though was how people who, just because you've been in an army in 21st century, doesn't mean anyone's actually taught you fieldcraft survival skills. And I'm not talking about can you gut an animal, and although that's helpful, I'm just talking about can you light a fire that isn't going to smoke? Because it's one thing for one dude to light a little fire and have a little column of smoke. When you've got 5,000 dudes and they're all lighting little fires and they're all smoky, that's visible, giving away your position on a wide front. So that it was a very interesting chat, and I did think it was interesting what he was saying, that Americans who'd been in the Marines or the Rangers were quite good at coping with not having all the bells and whistles.
Because they have to get by without the huge logistics support of the actual regular army. So
yeah.
They make do with what they've got.
Anyway, that was a very interesting chat, but I think at this point, I mean, obviously Ukraine is the biggest tank conflict of our time. Hopefully stays that way. And we're at the end of the year, so I guess looking back, Rob,
Well, it's going to go into a bit more about Ukraine. So the Russians have stepped up their missile attacks on civilian infrastructure. And so basically taking out all the power plants of the country. So most of the country is in blackout most of the time of the day.
And it's getting very cold.
And it's getting very cold. So basically they're just trying to make everybody so miserable and cold.
We talked about this last episode, though. If you know that the reason you're miserable is because those Russian bastards done it, then that's not going to change your mind about whether you want to resist them.
Now, with the missile landing in Poland, I want to talk about that for 2 seconds.
I mean, a very wise person tweeted, "Do not invoke Article 5 of NATO until you have identified the missile."
Yeah, a lot of people are saying that the missile is
Ukrainian S-300.
But somebody else pointed out, saying, if you look at the Latin longitudes of Kiev and Lviv, however you want to pronounce it, if you take the latitude of one and the longitude of the other, it ends up as the Polish town that was the Polish area that was hit. So somebody in Russia may have done a accidental copy paste of where they were shooting this missile, and that's where it's ended up.
Yeah, you're getting into numerology there. Admittedly, numerology with coordinates is real, but
I was about to say, when the two towns are sitting, if you're targeting these missiles and you're programming them in, you're just doing copy paste, copy paste.
I believe the missile ID wreckage has been ID'd.
I think that's my personal thoughts is that's because they give themselves coverage to not invoke Article 5. It is the cover up that so they can say, it was Ukrainian. But to my mind,
I certainly do not believe
incompetence sounds much more reliable to me than somebody a Ukrainian missile falling over there.
Mick has asked, has there been large tank-on-tank action? I mean, 12 aside in Ukraine. I believe there have been Ukrainian tank brigades engaging Russian tank forces, but I don't know for sure about that. We certainly did have when that Russian, with about 100 tanks, tried to cross the river.
Back in the beginning,
and got cut off and then blown apart by artillery from a Ukrainian tank brigade. But it was mostly the artillery doing the work there.
Yeah, when the Ukrainian engineer said, "Okay, if I was going to have to cross this river, where would I do it? I would do it there." And guess what? They lined that one up and said, "Okay, let's focus our artillery there." And the next day, a Russian tank brigade started coming across the pontoon bridges at that spot, and
which had been registered by the artillery.
got blown to hell.
Yeah.
So the Russians are basically trying to make everybody miserable by taking out all the electricity infrastructure within Ukraine, dropping thousands of tons of missiles and bombs and everything else in there. They've run out of their Iranian drones, and now they've got their own homegrown drones.
Which I did. I'm not trying to say I'm a genius, but I did mention that the Iranian drones totally rely on an Austrian company making engines for light sport aircraft. And that is a limited supply that I don't think the Austrians are planning to build a bigger factory to supply Iranian orders. It's an interesting little bottleneck, the engines. I think it's one that could be overcome with enough planning. So the idea of the sky dark with drones could happen at some point in the future, but we're not there yet. Okay. Bigger issues. What have we learned about modern war out of the Ukraine war this year, Rob?
Don't drive through the birch trees.
Don't drive through anywhere you see birch. Now, the reason for that is that birch grows in ground is soft and swampy enough that a tank will sink into it.
Yep.
So that's a big learning. I do think people have been... The initial thing was, all these Russian tanks are being destroyed. The tanks obsolete. what we have actually seen is that the tank is so crucial to modern warfare that it has to be put in harm's way, and there will be losses. I think we're up to 8,000 Russian vehicles destroyed, which includes a spectrum of stuff. But
and 90,000 people, troops.
Yeah.
And the Russians are still pushing on Mariupol and trying to get in there, and with no luck. Hopefully the Wagner group will pull out at some stage.
Apparently the Wagner group's recruiting in African prisons now, which...
Well, they are over there, so they've been deployed to prop up various regimes within Africa, like Uganda and somebody else over the border from there.
But I think what we are seeing is the value of information, which futurists have been talking about for 50 years now, but we are seeing writ large Ukraine is winning a war against a much larger neighbour because so far they have an unlimited amount of intelligence being pumped in by the Western powers, in particular the United States.
And a huge amount of hardware being pumped in by the West.
A lot of hardware, but the intelligence is letting the... And, I mean, I liked... We had the moment a few months ago when the Russians were really pounding the Ukrainians with artillery, and, we made the point, we weren't alone in it by any means, but, that the Ukrainians needed longer-legged artillery than the Russians, or they were going to lose the war, and that was when the HIMARS started getting pumped in there, which filled that gap, and allowed the Ukrainians to be targeting the Russian rear areas, and combined with intelligence and the capacity to hit rear areas, you've really got something.
Yeah, airfields don't move around a lot, so they're easy to hit.
And ammunition dumps.
Yep.
And,
but you got ammunition dumps you can cover up, and you don't know where they always are, but airfields you do. Look, who knows what's going to happen in the next coming weeks with the ground hardening in Ukraine, whether or not the Ukrainians will go on another offensive.
I mean, the town of Bakhmut is absolutely getting pounded, which is way out in the east of the country. And there's a lot of stuff on social media about the brave defenders of Bakhmut, which the Ukrainians have been absolutely on point with their social media / propaganda game. I hope the guys there don't die. I hope, wish the war would end and no one would die, but we don't get to make those calls. There is an interesting point that people have been raising with me, saying, why won't the Americans or the Europeans give Western tanks to Ukraine? I've got two reasons why they shouldn't. Firstly, the Ukrainians don't know how to use Western tanks, and the time it would take to train them would be significant.
Well, they've had 9 months, John. They've probably been training on those things.
Yeah, but
it wouldn't surprise me if there are some Leopard 2s start turning up in Ukrainian ranks. Same with they're looking at whether or not they're going to give them... I mean, this is all speculation. We haven't actually seen anything.
I mean, Gepards have already gone, but they're more not quite front line.
Yeah, no, they're defensive things. We just park them out the back, and not having to manoeuvre them around a lot in a combat situation. Then there's also discussion about whether or not anybody's going to give them some F-16s or the Vigans from...
Well, but this comes down to my second reason why this is a bad idea, which is that what we do not particularly want to do is give the Russians examples of modern Western gear. So there's two things that can happen to a, let's say, a Leopard 2 A7 or something like that goes to...
It may not be the most modern Leopard 2.
Okay, but let's say, for example, if people who are saying, why don't we give them the tanks... were to give them a highly modern Leclerc or or an up to date Leopard 2, the possibility of Ukrainians selling it to the wrong person is a significant risk.
One of the things of the conversation with Lindy Beige showed was
stuff goes missing.
Stuff goes missing, and there's a bit of nepotism going on in Ukraine. It's still influenced by a previous Russian regime. It's not a case of what they're not all above board, and that's not the that's what they have to deal with.
But I would also say that corruption in military procurement is not a wholly Ukrainian vice. It exists in every country in the world.
Usually,
just look at the Australian submarine purchases. But I would also say, even if Ukrainians don't sell one of the tanks to the Russians, there's just the risk of, the classic thing we talk every single episode, it feels like, someone's tank gets hit and they jump out because they're scared, with good reason, because being in a burning tank is one of the worst things that can ever happen.
They decide not to blow it up themselves and just run.
Well, they just don't have the opportunity. So then the Russians get hold of
a modern Western tank.
Yeah, and knowing just things like what wavelength is the radio receiver, there's a lot of things that are extremely valuable intelligence to be had from getting their hands on one of these things.
How to transperambulate the pseudo-antimatter.
Pseudo-cosmic antimatter, yeah.
These are things that are smarter people than us would be able to figure out by looking at a functioning tank.
Yeah. Anyway, I think
we're done.
We're done. All right.
All right, so we've covered the M26 Pershing. It's forays within World War II and Korea and a little bits afterwards, and who built it, who it was named after, where it went, and why do we have it.
The parade of arseholes. Yeah, I would note we are still drinking this terrible beer.
It did not go down fast.
It has not gone down fast. I would say, hey, we're at the end of a year.
It is.
We've been doing this podcast since 2019. And
pre-COVID days.
Not just that, though. The majority of our listeners started listening this year. So, hey, guys, girls, thank you so much for joining us and being part of it. According to Spotify, 500 people, we are the number one podcast for them.
I don't think I'm even on Spotify, so otherwise it'd be 527.
Yeah, so that's really awesome, and you know, we did have one of the listeners posted, "Oh, you guys are only number 3 on my list," and the other podcasts were really big, run by really professional historians. So that's really awesome, and I just want to say, you know, because it's the end of the year, we're allowed to get a little sentimental for Christmas time. We really appreciate all of you who listen.
We do.
And love's probably a little strong. We love that you listen to us. We appreciate you. But you know, we hope you all have a really good Christmas. We're not going to do a Christmas special this year. This is it. Hang on.
This was the day that we could actually both make it in here.
Yeah. Hang on, I'll get my hat back on. Cool. So it's a weird little community we've got. We noted when we were up at the Tank Festival that tank fans come in lots of different shapes and sizes, but we're kind of united by an interest in a weird little niche and a lack of affectation, which is quite pleasant to be around.
And I got myself a nice little Christmas present that I will be building in the new year, John.
Oh,
yes.
Is it a model tank?
It is a model tank.
Is it the PZ-38 too?
It might be.
Okay, we're going to have to talk to you all about which one to buy. We are going to do a group build project. Is your daughter going to help you build it?
I'm sure she can help.
Okay. Is she going to paint it?
Maybe, maybe not. We'll see. I'll see what my patience levels are like. I might give her other things to paint because I've also got other things that I've ordered and that she'll be more inclined to working on.
Anyway,
but we work together. It is school holidays. Will be a long period of time where I'll be working from home, looking after a child who I need to distract with certain things, which will include painting models.
Yep. So just to finish up, do please, if you can, if you do it, track us down on Facebook and Twitter and follow us. We're also on Mastodon because it's the non-evil social media, but because it's not evil, it doesn't have anyone using it. But hey, I post our episodes and various things on Mastodon, and you know what? There's a lot of other cool people on Mastodon, so that's fun. And if you are moved to, we do have some really cool T-shirts on Redbubble.
We won't let Ye subscribe to our podcast either. There you go.
I don't think we can stop him.
Oh, I'm sure we can. We won't let him.
Yeah, or Trump.
Yeah.
No, never Trump. No. We'll close this podcast down if Trump becomes a follower. I don't think Donald listens to many podcasts.
Having other people tell you what...
While we're here at the arse end of the podcast, let's just say, can you imagine having the colossal pan-galactic ego of Kanye going to Mar-a-Lago and saying to Donald Trump, the only man...
You can be my VP.
Yeah.
No, you can be my VP. He must have watched Top Gun 1 or whatever.
Oh God, I wish I had those kind of stones. All right, okay, we're done.
We're done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, folks.
Care. Enjoy your. Hopefully, everybody has a safe and peaceful end of the year, and we'll see you next year with a new tank. We might be slightly later in January because who knows?
Rob has coastal real estate to spend time in.
Damn straight.
There's surfing
awesome.
and swimming and oysters and lobsters. Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure about lobsters. But
Okay. All right. Thanks, folks. We'll see you in the new year.